I know that clinical utility is often at the core of the debate around the utilization and the reimbursement for diagnostic testing. A recent study published in BMC Cancer looked at this very topic and provided compelling results around analytical utility of the PAM50 gene panel. Now, are you aware of similar validation data from other genomic assays for breast cancer?
Sure. There are two fundamental questions around clinical utility. Does the information change decision making? And second, does the information change clinical outcomes? I think in all three of the primary assays available in this country, MammaPrint, Oncotype, and PAM50, there is information to suggest that that information is prognostic, that a low score correlates with no benefit from chemotherapy and a higher score benefits with benefit from chemotherapy. So I think the answer is yes, there is clinical utility data for all three of those.
All right, and how does Prosigna data measure up against the existing gene signature platforms?
As a payer, that kind of detail is a little more difficult for us to assess, but my understanding of the relative merits of those in the TransAttack trial, where we compared the results of the Oncotype DX to PAM50, there was more discrimination amongst the patients who had the PAM50 because there were fewer people in that intermediate category who were not certain if they benefit from chemotherapy or not, and more patients who had a definitive answer about whether or not they benefited from chemo or not.
So there was a stratification advantage?
Yes.
All right. Does the FDA review and clearance influence provider acceptance over the current platforms being used?
My suspicion is that yes. From a payer perspective, FDA approval simply means that there's been an understanding of the clinical and analytic validity of the test. It doesn't make the test better, it just means it's subject to scrutiny.
Okay, somebody looked at it.
Somebody's looked at it. Somebody independent has looked at the data
right.
To assess that utility.
Theoretically, some unbiased source.
Some unbiased source, yes.
Does the adoption then of new assays such as Prosigna to large testing laboratories provide a new value proposition to payers?
Fundamentally, it comes down to, do we understand the data and the differences between the data? We're looking at the clinical utility. Does this influence decision-making and does it influence outcomes? I think those are the real measures. Ultimately, when everybody's measured the same way because the FDA is reviewing all tests, it'll become much easier, and when that becomes the floor.
There's a solid maybe for you.
Yeah.
A recent study, the TransAttack trial, was published last year in JCO. The trial conducted a head-to-head evaluation of Prosigna based on PAM50 and the Oncotype DX to predict disease recurrence. Why don't you share your thoughts on the importance of the study?
Ultimately, what we as payers want, what providers want, what patients want is to understand what optimal diagnostic tests exist and what optimal therapies exist. And I think these head-to-head trials provide some answers about what treatment or what diagnostic tests are optimal. In that study, they found that 26% fewer patients were in that intermediate category where we're not certain whether or not they benefit from chemotherapy. In contrast then, in the PAM50 compared to the Oncotype DX, more patients were put into the high-risk category. What we're concerned about is patients get a treatment that's appropriate for their condition, and the fact that more patients are put in the chemotherapy category is not concern. It just means that that was the right patient therapy for that patient.
So again, it's a stratification issue. It's not so much that you're concerned about what stratum they're in, but that they're in the right stratum.
That's correct.
And those that clearly would benefit from therapy, if they were previously in the I don't know category, might be at some risk.
Yeah.
That is to say they could have benefited but didn't get it because they were miscategorized.
So that's in the node positive or node negative circumstance, that we have fewer patients in that intermediate category. So there's less lack of clarity around how to treat those patients. In the node positive patients, on the other hand, where they're just low risk and high risk, the tests between the Oncotype DX and the PAM50 are pretty comparable.